got mail.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Eric Rayson. I have the pleasure of serving as CEO of BBB National Programs, the nonprofit organization where businesses turn to enhance consumer trust and where consumers are heard. 50 years ago, after pressures grew on the power of ads and some criticisms grew on the perceived dishonesty of ads, the advertising industry created a mechanism of self-regulation that has stood the test of time and technological innovation. And for the last 50 years in the advertising industry, companies have held each other to a higher standard through independent industry self-regulation. So today is a happy day for all of us appearing on Zoom. We gather today to commemorate the 50th anniversary of this successful system of independent industry self-regulation and to join the leaders of the founding organizations of what former Federal Trade Commission Chairman Robert Pitofsky calls the best example of self-regulation that I'm aware of in American industry. Over the course of the next hour or so, we'll talk why the system of industry self-regulation works, the challenges faced by advertisers and regulators through the years, and a few memorable moments in advertising history that we will not soon forget. But we'll not just be chatting about the past. We'll also be focusing on the future of advertising law, and of industry self-regulation. So, joining me today are four respected leaders in the advertising world. Bob Liudisi, Chief Executive Officer, Association of National Advertisers, also known as ANA. Marla Kaplowitz, President and CEO of the American Association of Advertising Agencies, also known as 4As. Steve Pacheco, President and CEO of the American Advertising Federation, also known as AAF. And my esteemed colleague at BBB National Programs, Laura Brett, our Vice President of our National Advertising Division and our New York office leader here at BBB National Programs. So let's begin our conversation. And to level set our audience, Laura, why don't you start us off and tell us how the National Advertising Division and our appellate division, the National Advertising Review Board, started in 1971?
Sure. So in 1971, I want you to kind of think back to what television advertising looked like in 1971. You had a lot of different television ads out there. You're looking at cleaning products that are telling their consumers that they're going to clean faster, better, or easier with a product like Spick and Span. You've got foods that are being advertised to make your life easier, to make your life, to make meal prep faster, and to make your life better. You've got shake and bake. Think back. Instant coffee was a very popular ad back in the early 1970s. Same with instant tea. And some consumers are watching these ads, looking at these products, and making purchases, thinking, are they living up to their promises? And I think it's also important to remember that back then, cigarette advertising was the largest industry being advertised on television, and consumers are increasingly learning that cigarettes are very harmful for your health. This atmosphere of advertising, emerging on television as a major force in forcing consumer purchasing decision, and that growing distrust led to the founding of the NARB, which was the focus of the industry system of self-regulation back in 1971 when it was founded. The concept was that the NARB, the National Advertising Review Board, would be consisted of industry leaders, advertising industry leaders, who would hold the advertising industry to high standards so that consumers could trust advertising and they could build confidence that advertising to consumers was truthful. And NAD at that time was viewed to be the investigator, and NAD would pull in evidence and investigate it, and then when NAD would make its initial determination, if the advertiser agreed, that would be fine and everybody would move on. If the advertiser didn't agree with NAD, they could appeal to this industry body of leaders. But I want to thank the founding associations and the leading brand working group that suggested the self-regulatory system of the NAD and the NARB, because it's really formed a solid foundation for independent industry self-regulation that's been an example for its 50-year history, and an excellent example, and really promoted trust in advertising.
Well, you're right, Laura. The founding associations of the NARB and are then known as investigatory arm, the NAD, are here. Their CEOs are here today with us on this Zoom call. So why don't I ask each of our CEOs on the phone, what was going on in 1971 in your important association? What sort of challenges were you facing? And what's your high-level perspective on this system of self-regulation as a solution? Let me start looking at my Zoom camera shows that Bob Ludisi is next to me, so I will go with him first. Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Eric, and it's really a wonderful honor to be here. Self-regulation is the backbone of our entire industry. And in many ways, it's also the great insurance policy for our industry. It's the kind of thing that you're glad is there, but you don't always tap into it until you need it. And that was the wisdom of the founders way back then in 1971. 50 years, can you believe it? 50 years we've had a self-regulatory process that was built off of a consumer movement that was absolutely necessary at that time. And the reason for that was that the foundation for advertising success was trust. And we needed, at that point in time, the ability to elevate trust within our industry, to ensure that the ads that were seen on television or heard on radio were absolutely accurate and reflected that trust and honesty that consumers expected out of them. Concept of self-regulation was novel, and that innovation came forward in a beachhead of self-regulation that started with NAD, NARB, and then advanced into KRU within a short span. But what I found most fascinating at that particular point in time was the bond that it created with the FTC. Now, Eric, you mentioned what Robert Potofsky said when he acknowledged that the NAD and the self-regulatory process run by the BBB national programs was absolutely the best that he had seen in that industry. And that is critical for us to be successful today, and it will be for tomorrow. So congratulations, self-regulation is here to stay, and it is definitely part of our future.
Thank you, Bob. Marla, why don't you give some thoughts on your association 4As and where you were thinking at that time?
I think what's so impressive is when you think back on this history of self-regulation, it really reflects this entire community coming together. And so it started 50 years ago with the creation of the National Advertising Division, but we also over a decade ago created the Digital Advertising Alliance for the marketing and advertising industry, addressing responsible privacy practices for relevant digital advertising. And the BBB national programs serves as the accountability agent for the DAA with the Digital Advertising Accountability Program. And that's highly focused on data privacy in web and mobile advertising. I think what's key is that both of these programs, and as Bob said, start with the consumer. So it's also supporting the business needs, but it's so important that we get back to that idea of consumer trust. That's what this is all about. And it's not about how you do right by business, but how does business do right by the consumer? And so when you bring people together that deeply understand the dynamics to address this really critical challenge, you can align on a better, transparent, and more effective way forward. And that's what the NAD continues to do, in my view, in a truly exemplary way.
Thank you, Marla. Steve, your thoughts?
Yeah, again, thanks for having us here today. I think it's an important timeline marker for the history of what has happened and transpired to get us to this point. I also see it as a great celebration of some great work that's been done. And the AAF couldn't be prouder of our legacy of self-regulation that goes back those 50 years, still embedded in our DNA as a 100-plus-year-old organization. And when you stop and consider that the AAF has grown exponentially since those early days, our focus on doing the right and ethical thing has never wavered. We've consistently evolved, and we're steadily looking for ways to support and expand this important work. And today's session is critical for raising awareness of this work and letting more know about it. we're first and foremost always advocating for advertising, and that all we do is geared to advance and advocate for the advertising industry. As the unifying voice for advertising, and with a far-reaching spectrum of members that are aged from 18 to 80, we want to give voice to all, especially in regards to self-regulation. And we're particularly proud of our own Howard Bell, who's known as the father of advertising self-regulation, and his contemporary, Wally Snyder, for continuing that commitment to the industry. Both Howard and Wally were former CEOs of the AAF, and they both had the vision and the foresight to establish and expand the important foundation on which most of this important work has been built on. Wally in particular has always preached trust and transparency in all of our relationships and in all of our work, and it's important to both of their legacies to see this grow over these past 50 years. And in my mind, it's certainly worthy of a true celebration.
Thank you, Steve. So to roadmap what we're going to do today, we're going to talk about, I think, 3 phases. The pre-internet phase, the post-internet phase to today, and frankly, what does the future look like? So why don't we start off with the 70s through, I guess, early 90s, if my timing is correct, on pre-internet. And let's talk a little bit about some of the themes and fads that drove the time in advertising history and ad law, and some of the major moments in those early decades. And let me start first with Marla. Why don't you go ahead first? Thank you.
Sure. And I started out in this business as a media person. So I look at it through that lens. And advertising was in such a different place in the 70s with analog media and a limit on the number of TV channels that anyone could watch at a given time. And then the 80s really experienced the launch of cable networks. I Want My MTV, and trying to understand the impact to viewing behaviors. And then in the 90s, you saw a real proliferation of cable, but consumers also started experiencing much shorter commercial units. People were experimenting a lot more with not just 30s, 15s, and product choice really started to proliferate at that time with flankers and line extensions. And that became a bit overwhelming for the consumer, and they didn't even know it was about to hit them with internet advertising.
Bob, your thoughts on the same time frame?
Yeah, I think Marla did a great job recapping that. Yeah, I think we look at that period as a time of tremendous transition for the consumer. As Marla indicated, the media landscape was dramatically changing, especially the move to cable and video as a new tool. But we were also inundated with heavy-duty telemarketing and local phone companies, which were dominating at that stage and essentially becoming a monopoly. And where do you go for trust? Well, with all of that happening at the same time, and as a predilection for a lot more complexity to come, the BBB national program served so many different consumers at that point in time. And it was so important for the NAD and the NARB to be at its game, because competition among marketers really heated up. If I know one thing about marketers, share of market became so important. And at that point in time, a lot of marketing companies were going head to head and battling for that share of market, and often released ads that were not necessarily 100% true. And so we needed that body of self-regulation across the board, particularly in the children's arena, that ensured the integrity of our ads and ensured that everybody played with honesty and fairness and the wisdom necessary to be able to catapult our industry forward. So that period of transition right before the highly dynamic internet years was critical for self-regulation to gain a very, very deep foothold into the fabric of the way we conducted business. And I think we're all proud to say that it was extraordinarily successful.
Steve, your thoughts on the pre-internet world?
Yeah, I mean, Marla hit it. The early days were dominated by the big 3 TV networks. Radio was bigger than ever. Print was strong, and of course there was no internet. So the change in the amount of rapid transformation is probably unrivaled in any period of modern American history. And again, we all took an early leadership position within the advertising industry, and we helped create credibility and a solid foundation for all this work. I think particularly with the AAF, we also helped spread the good news all across North America through our grassroots network. We continued to influence young professionals about the value and importance of self-regulation through our collegiate chapter network and our campus to corporate programs, and even our national student ad competition has informed and educated hundreds of college students about ethics and regulation if you stop to consider that we've literally inspired 2 or 3 generations of advertising leaders on this topic. And I think we're completely in sync on that.
Well, Laura, why don't you provide a little context for us? What cases, what ad law, what was NAD doing in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s?
Sure. So just a bit of history. The very first NAD decision heard by the NARB related to GM's mark of excellence, and whether or not that was a truthful claim for GM, which the NARB concluded was. But all of these early cases, that one and the second one heard by the NARB related to the American Dairy Association, were all brought by advocates, and the advocates were pushing this process. They weren't sure that self-regulation was going to work. They were skeptical, and so they brought a lot of the early challenges, including that GM challenge and the one that was second, the American Dairy Association. And so it was up to the NARB to prove that this was effective. And in fact, that first case, they didn't make any changes to GM's mark of excellence, but the second case, the American Dairy Association case, the claims for the American Dairy Association was that milk could boost energy. And the NARB made some recommended changes to that claim to make it clear that milk's ability to boost energy was not immediate. But what we saw over time was an increasing reliance on NAD by competitors, because Bob was talking about that competitive landscape really changing. And we did see a lot more competitor challenges, such that, say, 5 years in, instead of 80% of the cases being brought by NAD or referred by local BBBs, you had a flip, right? You had a flip where more and more cases were being brought by competitors. Today, we see at least 80% of our cases being brought by competitors, and the competitors are a really effective way of learning whether or not advertising is truthful. But we also learned that the NAD decision, the NARB decisions themselves provided independent guidance, right? So you don't necessarily have to bring a challenge. You can actually learn from prior challenges what the standards are for truthfulness and accuracy in advertising. And so you see an evolution of NAD guidance on that, and NAD guidance in the decision itself, so that in the early 1990s, actually, when my predecessor director began leading the NAD, Andrea Levine, you saw the NAD decisions become more robust themselves, so that they could in fact be relied on by companies to provide guidance within themselves. So they didn't necessarily have to rely exclusively on the challenge process. But at the time, we also saw increasing detail from the FTC about what standards for substantiation look like, right? You see more policy statements from the FTC, you see more guidance from the FTC, and all of that helped NAD provide consistent guidance and set a consistent standard for advertising, so that it developed this robust system that didn't stand by itself, but in fact supported the acts of the FTC, and building on that relationship with the FTC over the years, such that 25 years in, Chairman Petovsky was calling out the NAD as a really effective system of self-regulation. But that was in large part by design, because because of the NAD's reliance on the FTC for setting the standard, and NAD just applying it in new contexts, like we saw when media was changing.
That's right. Certainly back then, there were a number of prominent politicians and effective leaders who on both sides of the aisle that complemented the work of the National Advertising Division and NARB, senators, congressmen, future vice presidents, and so forth. What's interesting, though, and you mentioned sort of the case law, Laura, and we now, I believe, have over 6,000 decisions during our history, which organizations, both nonprofit and companies and lawyers, can see and use as they provide advice to their clients, making sure that there is truthfulness in the marketplace. Let's switch over a little bit later. Now we're now in the early 90s. My hair was a little bit different back then, but we're in the early 90s. I'll let you guess which MTV, you mentioned MTV, Marla, I'll let you guess which MTV character or band I was following back in the early 90s, but others will probably search on the internet right now to try and find it, hopefully not. But why don't we go to the early 90s and talk about some of the largest or complex hurdles once the internet came about. Marla, why don't you go first?
Yeah, for me, the shift with the internet, we really went from this idea of mass marketing, mass media, to this shift to one to few and even one to one with interactive marketing. That's what we called digital marketing in the early days. And this eventually led to the creation of programmatic advertising, really at the end of the aughts, to leverage technology, connecting data through automation to really buy and optimize digital media channels. And moving on, we then saw the proliferation and complexity of the digital supply chain, some of the challenges that came with that, with fraud, malvertising, really a need to understand all the different components. And I think it's just a reflection of the acceleration and the speed of innovation that continues unabated, but that also requires a need for due diligence with self-regulation. And right now, we can really see the impact of that with the rise of social media, creating even consumer reviews and influencer marketing, and how that needs to be monitored for truth and transparency. And there was just something in the news about that very recently, about how do you really understand the veracity of these reviews that are coming forward, and what is real versus what is not. So there's so much work that will continue to need to be done in this area.
Thank you, Marla. Sticking in the early 90s again, Bob, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I think Marla set the table up very, very well. It was another massive inflection point with the introduction of what is now called digital advertising and marketing. And that just opened up the floodgates for marketers and advertisers to create a more profound one-to-one relationship, as Marla had indicated, with consumers. And that allowed for the personalization of ads, the ability to connect and create the relationships. And it began the beginning of performance marketing, per se, at that stage. So it was a wonderful period for advertisers and marketers to be able to move out of just sheer contextual marketing to an advanced form of relationship building with consumers and customers, to say the least. But with that came trouble. It began the issues of privacy controls, transparency issues, the development eventually of the walled gardens, and essentially the beginning of driving our relationships that could expand globally, because technology was such an important lever that we were no longer constrained by boundaries. And with that came a series of complex issues that we had to be able to navigate. How do we manage transparency? How do we manage privacy-related issues? And how do we control the data complexities that the walled gardens essentially created and navigated, and is now a critical issue with respect to programmatic media and marketing? Well, you need your self-regulatory processes. And in particular, Marla mentioned this earlier about the introduction of the DAA, and that came in the 2000s. But that began a movement towards understanding what was truly concerning to consumers, and how our industry came together to ensure that we were appropriately protecting consumers and elevating that trust in this wild and crazy world that was now dominated by marketing and media that most consumers were not necessarily familiar with or knowing how to be able to navigate. And so we as an industry had to come together. We had to rally around the self-regulatory vehicles and mechanisms to ensure that we had that stability, to ensure that we were doing right by all, and especially children, who I think marketers defaulted to treating them as mini adults, which was a false assumption and not necessarily in the best interests of advertisers and marketers at that point in time, which necessitated another phenomenal program by the BBB, which was called the Food and Beverage Initiative, which was a standard bearer for self-regulation, which eventually traveled around the world. So a lot of dynamics, a lot of an increased need for self-regulation. And again, I think we moved up the ladder in terms of capability and our overall performance.
Thank you, Bob. And we at BBB National Programs now have 16 programs. A few of them have been named throughout the early part of this conversation, but thank you again for mentioning our CFBAI, our Children's Food and Beverage Initiative. Steve, why don't you go ahead? We're in the 90s, or we're now getting closer to today. So go ahead. Feel like a radio station.
Well, I do remember those days, and I had different hair as well. But and I was a brand marketer during that period, so I'll speak from that perspective as well. And what we saw is an incredible acceleration of the pace to market. The speed to market became even more critical and important. Both Bob and Marla had mentioned that tech and innovation drove a lot of these changes and powered up all the different things that were happening. On the bright side, integrated campaigns became much more common, and people were matching their offline and their online activities. Those that were successful at it were, at least. And so that adds a whole nother element of regulation and verifying. I'll also point out that competition in the marketplace probably peaked as well. And sometimes that went a bit unchecked or not as regulated as we all would have liked. Standards and practices at the networks were stretched thin. There was an awful lot of work coming in, and the bandwidth might not have been there to be able to support that. When you add to the fact that attention spans were starting to get challenged, and people were now no longer fully vested in long form content. They were getting all that chopped up and fractionalized and having so much messaging coming at them. They were literally being bombarded by marketing communications messaging during the 90s. And I think many just didn't take the long view. Short-term profits took center stage, and a lot of corporate marketers and folks who were looking to not only build their brand, but build their revenues were, again, not taking the long view and looking for short-term profits and maybe taking shortcuts as well. So the importance and the unification of having a broad industry standard became maybe even more important during that decade than any other time.
Thank you, Steve. So I guess we're getting closer to today. So Laura, why don't we talk about the shift to digital and how the National Advertising Division transitioned to that basis?
Sure. So the shift to digital did not require any changes to the advertising self-regulatory system, because the way it had been designed was to be adaptable, right? Instead of creating a code-based thing like we see in a lot of other countries, the standard that NAD reviews advertising to is just simply that it be truthful and transparent. And in applying those standards, we do rely on the FTC. But that flexible standard has made it very, very adaptable as we've seen advertising shift to digital. In other countries, there's still questions about what is advertising. But here in the US, it's been pretty clear from the outset that advertising is in fact anything that you're doing to promote a product or service, right? So if it's online, it's on your website. If it's through social media, those are all aspects of advertising. So we've been able to pretty effectively address advertising, even as it has shifted completely to digital. And what that's meant sometimes is that we're sometimes, instead of following the FTC, we're often ahead of the FTC in terms of providing specific guidance to advertising in new platforms. I mean, we certainly saw that when we first saw the shift to native advertising and a lot of discussion about that. We simply applied FTC guidance on deceptively formatted ads to this new advertising context. And we're able to provide that guidance before the FTC came out with its later policy statements and guidance on native advertising. We've done the same with influencer marketing, applying FTC guidance on endorsements and testimonials before the FTC updated its guidance on influencer marketing, which we then apply. So working together, it feels like we are expanding on the work of the FTC and making sure that advertisers that are trying to abide by the rules have consistent guidance about what those rules are, even before they hear from the FTC specifically on the new issues. And we hope to do the same thing with dark patterns. Dark patterns is something that we've been looking at for a long time and applying FTC guidance on what was not yet named dark patterns, and by looking at deceptively formatted ads again, or misleading disclosures and FTC guidance with regard to .com disclosures. So we are poised well to really address emerging issues, in large part because it was set up so effectively at the beginning with this broad, flexible standard.
On that point, dark patterns, Laura, you just testified in an FTC working meeting on dark patterns. What were some of the things that, I'm going to call an audible and say, what were some of the things that NAD has seen that you sort of gave as your advice to the FTC when you spoke just last week?
Sure. I mean, so one thing we tried to underscore with the FTC is to the extent they want to come out with guidance on dark patterns, that is guidance that the industry can apply using self-regulation, right? So FTC's enforcement powers on any issue are going to be limited. So what you want is a self-regulatory system that can expand the impact of the FTC's guidance, which companies can do using self-regulation. But we also made it clear that, I'd like to make clear here today that there's a lot of guidance out there for companies that are investigating, how to sell their product online and looking at purchase flow and questions like that. And the good guidance is make sure that those disclosures follow .com disclosures, guidance from the FTC. Make sure that when you're giving a consumer choice, they understand what that choice is and they understand the material terms of that choice before they reach the purchasing decision, before they get to that final page where they're entering in their credit card information. There's a lot of guidance out there on dark patterns, and it's guidance that we are applying. But it to me, a lot of it comes down to basic standards of truth and transparency, and making sure consumers know what they're doing before they enter into a purchasing transaction, or check yes on a privacy policy, or and making sure that they understand the material terms at the time they're making the purchasing decision, which I think is crucial.
Before we turn to the future, Bob, Steve, Marla, anything you want to talk about in addition to what you just said about today?
Want me to start?
Sure.
Yeah. I think what Laura articulated is something that, first of all of us in our industry really need to pay attention to, and that is, what is that particular guidance? And I think that is a message that often gets lost, particularly among the client-side marketers. We really need to be able to step forward and ensure that we understand what the rules of the game are, that we understand what that guidance is, we understand how to be able to truly put the consumer first in all of the marketing that we do. And that is increasingly difficult when you consider the complexity of all of the media choices that marketers are facing with influencer marketing, social media, and the variety of technical ways to be able to reach a consumer and customer. The rules of the game are not always as understandable as they were when NAD got started 50 years ago. And in that regard, it's very important that you stay close to your general counsel and all of your legal representatives to ensure that you understand the best business practices of the NAD. And as we move forward in terms of the complexity and where the future is, privacy stands out far and away as one of the most important consumer concerns that we have today. All you have to do is to read any of the publications that take place, and you're hearing things such as GDPR and California privacy law, et cetera, et cetera. And consumers are abundantly confused out there. So what I am most concerned about is to ensure that marketers recognize that it is very clear that consumers do not understand all of the choices that are out there. But consumers are speaking with a louder and louder voice and voicing the need to have their rights protected. And we as an industry have to stand at the forefront to ensure that those things take place, that it is not about profits first, it is about consumers first. And I think that it is a growing awareness among our industry to ensure that the rights and privileges of consumers are out there. And all you need to do is to take a look at the way consumer rights are essentially being permeated through the vast technology that's taking place out there. There is so much that we as individuals do not understand, and the rights that we may in fact be giving away, whether it's on any of the social platforms or any of the boxes that we check for relinquishing privacy controls or anything to that effect. And that gets even further complicated by the expansion into the global terrain. The fact that now ads are in fact going globally, we have to be increasingly responsible in the way we behave. And all of that continues to bring us back to our roots that started 50 years ago about relying upon BBB national programs and all of their self-regulatory mechanisms.
I think Bob just underscored the complexity and what has really happened and the shifts over the last 50 years. And I know for the agency community, it's all about how do you simplify the complex, whether that be for marketers, for consumers, trying to make sense of all of this and wade through it. New laws, new approaches, new means of connecting with consumers. it's not going to get any simpler. And so it's so critical to ensure that we do have the appropriate self-regulation in place and that programs like the NAD continue.
Steve, what about today?
Well, I couldn't agree more. And I think fundamentally with all these new platforms and new metrics and new audiences, that there's new confusion, and the consumer does have an awful lot to consider before making a purchase decision or choice. And I think to Bob's point, we all must focus on the consumers first and foremost. And as an industry, we have a deep responsibility, and we've shown that over the last 50 years, to do the right thing. I think a lot of times we get lost in the numbers, and we like to take the view that it's markets of one. There are individuals that are making these decisions, and they need to be as well informed as they possibly can. The only other color commentary that I will add is that I believe that the pace of the change is never going to slow down, and indeed may even accelerate even further. And I think the pace of change is going to be something we all have to keep our eyes on and try to keep up with, candidly. An example of doing a great job of that is BBB's national programs and the NAD SWIFT process that you or Laura may want to talk about, but to be able to take something all the way to resolution, in as little as 24 hours in some cases, is certainly an example of doing the right thing. And I think more importantly, showing the pace of how these issues are commented on and hopefully acted on.
Well, Steve, since you introduced it, we'll be happy to talk about Fast Track SWIFT. Last year, we created at the National Advertising Division two new tracks. We created a complex track for really complicated matters, and Fast Track SWIFT, which will guarantee a decision within 20 business days. But you're right, sometimes the advertisers receive the challenge and 24 hours later, it's done. It's put into a box and done. Laura, do you want to add to that? Obviously, you're leading our division in that area, so feel free to jump in a little bit on that.
Sure.
This is all thank you, Steve.
Thanks for the lead in on that. Yep. So right, Fast Track SWIFT was designed to respond to the challenges of digital advertising. We were hearing from the advertising community generally that while 4 to 6 months for an NAD challenge is a lot faster than court, a lot of their ad campaigns come and go out of the marketplace much faster than that. And so we created this new system for resolving certain kinds of issues more quickly, and it's called Fast Track SWIFT. We hope to expand it over time and be even more responsible to what we see are the emerging issues of trust and truth and transparency, which are that these things come and go so fast, and we want self-regulation to be sufficiently responsive to it. Now, to add on that, to build on the Fast Track SWIFT process, we're also working with platforms to try and get them to support truth in advertising by taking referrals from NAD. So the FTC has been a great partner for self-regulation for our 50-year history, and we literally could not be successful if they didn't take our referrals so seriously and follow up on them with such regularity. But we also recognize the pressure on the FTC if we try and move faster, right? And we want the advertising to be taken off out of the marketplace more quickly in response to competitor challenges or things that we open on our own. And so we partnered with Facebook just last November 2020, and announced that Facebook will take referrals from NAD. They've given us a dedicated reporting channel, and then they follow up on that report and determine whether or not the advertising that's referred to them complies with their truth in advertising principles for their platform. And we hope that other platforms will take Facebook's lead. It's really important for the advertising industry generally, right? And that now includes platforms to embrace this self-regulatory system and demonstrate that truth in advertising is important to them, and therefore they will too take referrals from NAD and our sister programs that support truth in advertising and make sure that advertising on their platform remains truthful.
Yeah, I think it's important to say that 90 to 95%, this is a 50-year look, 90 to 95% of the decisions at the NAD and NARB are just adopted by competitors and challenges. And in that 5%, that's when we're referring to Facebook and for 50 years to the Federal Trade Commission. And those small number of cases we're talking about, but it's an important avenue in the self-regulatory process. So why don't we pivot? I am certainly no Nostradamus. I don't know if any of you are, but why don't we pivot to the future? What will the future look like? Either next few years, the next 50 years, your choice. And I'm going to start with Steve.
Oh, wow. Okay, on the hot seat. I'll tell you, I do believe that the next 50 years will probably bring about 3 times more change than the past 50 years. The fact of the matter is we've already seen such rapid transitions and changes, and adding digital and social and mobile and search and voice and everything else. It's only going to extend and amplify because the technology will be there. And I think that's something we all have to be tuned into. What I don't think will change is that people are still going to need to be able to trust the information that they get and be able to have all the means necessary to trust and verify, and to be able to confirm that and look for more intelligent and secure information sources that point them in the right direction. People are going to want to have everything fact checked. We've seen that in the past 6 months, certainly. I do believe that these markets of one and the consumer focus is still going to be primary, still going to be at the top of what our consideration sets are. And I think we have to appeal to them with meaningful change and with good, solid, factual information.
Markets of one. That is an interesting concept of what it means today, what it meant 15 years ago, and what it will mean 20 years from now. Who would have thought even today, in terms of the markets of one that we receive on social media or through the platforms right now, and managing what it will be in 50 years is just amazing to me, when I will be over 100 in 50 years. Let me turn to, I hope I'm 100, not still around. Let me turn to Laura. Why don't you go ahead on your predictions on the future?
Sure. So, as I hear all of you in the middle of the advertising industry talk about the challenges that you're facing, and the threats to truth and transparency, it reminds me that it sounds very much like what we heard about in the early 1970s, and that led to the creation of the advertising industry system of self-regulation. When we start hearing consumers complain about trust and transparency, we start hearing businesses complain that there's not a level playing field. They don't have transparent information with which to make their business decisions, or that there's just an erosion of trust. It's important to remember that self-regulation can be part of that solution. It was back in 1971, and it can be today. But the important thing about our system of self-regulation that distinguishes it from others is that it is independent, right? It's not industry self-regulation in that it was led by industry, but the industry had the good judgment to recognize that credibility depended on it being independent, and so they set it up underneath the umbrella of what was then the Council of Better Business Bureaus, and now is part of BBB National Programs. And that independence gives it credibility both with consumers, with advocates, and with government. So as we look to face the challenges ahead of us, I think it's important to recognize the value that industry self-regulation can provide. And I do know that we take seriously all of the issues that you're raising about the difficulty in raising the bar for truth and transparency right now. That's why we've done things like launch Fast Track Swift. It's also why we're trying to increase resources on our website and elsewhere for the broad advertising community that is out there today. It's not led by major brands, but in fact, we're seeing it more and more divergent. We want them to have information about how to be truthful and transparent in their advertising, and to seize the opportunity to use the industry system of self-regulation to build trust. And we do think that the system of self-regulation is built for industry to raise the bar, and in fact, rather than having to race to the bottom line and race to the bottom in a way that may be misleading consumers and eroding trust in the marketplace in a way that ultimately is harmful for all.
Yeah, energizing the industry to think more collaboratively about how we address these problems going forward is going to be key to the next 50 years. I agree with you, Laura, and I agree with many of your sentiments on the important role of independent industry self-regulation. Marla, what do you see in the next 10, 20, and 50 years?
Yeah, I think we all recognize that something needs to happen moving forward with all of the conversations around data privacy, with what's happened in Europe with GDPR, with California and CCPA and CPRA, and we're now going to be moving towards a cookieless future. And so we talked earlier about moving from contextual advertising to more targeted advertising. I think we're having a bit of a shift back to the future, as we're not going to rely as much on such discrete data. Consumers are making it very clear what they want to share, what they don't want to share. And we need to be respectful of that and understand how to leverage that to still create relevant advertising. But there are different aspects to data privacy, whether you're talking about financial data, health information, or how do you make marketing more relevant. And so we are going to need to either have some sort of intervention from a government standpoint or through self-regulation. I think we'll probably see a mix of both, but it's clear that something has to happen. And this scrutiny of truth, transparency will continue. I do think that's one of the aspects, if we look back on the last 50 years, as Laura said, that's what happened in the 70s, and that's what is starting to surface once again. And you look at what's happening now in Florida. We've talked a lot about social media and the platforms, and there's new legislation that essentially says politicians couldn't lie on social platforms, but that social platforms can't stop that. And so there's going to be, I think, just far more scrutiny of who is responsible for regulating the platforms, what does that content look like? And there is no one answer, especially as each is managing the content in their own way. And so we will need some sort of consistency. So I think it's important as we look ahead to always look back, as history will repeat itself, and think, what have we learned that we can apply for the future and ensure that we get some of those things right moving forward. But I think you still have, nothing has changed as it relates to consumer trust, transparency. That will always continue.
It's interesting what you say, Marla, on sort of the velocity of change, the velocity of legislation, and obviously, in here we are in 2021, and we're talking about, Section 230 and state laws regarding privacy and the rights of platforms of what are they governmental, they're not governmental, First Amendment doesn't apply, all those various topics that are going forward. I think one of the interesting things over the next decade or two, and I sort of view this as pendulum swinging back and forth. In the 70s, when this was created, there was consumerism, which at the time had the definition of everyone should buy more things. It was more along the lines of consumer protection. And then we saw sort of through the 80s, a reduction in regulation. In the 90s, we saw under the Clinton administration, you saw a little bit more, and so we're going back and forth with the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and here we are now in the Biden administration, where I think consumer protection will take another focus, but we'll see it going back and forth. I think the interesting issue, though, on individuals, if we look generationally, we look at what Generation Alpha deems as private information and what Generation X, or which many of us on the phone are, on Zoom are, which is a little bit more private than Generation Alpha in terms of individualized advertising, individualized privacy. Folks give up a little bit more generationally in Generation Alpha than they do in Generation X, although who knows what we'll see as people go forward. And that will be a really interesting trend in my mind over the next couple of decades as to what is the reasonable expectation of privacy, both from a consumer side, a company side, and the government as people deem where things go forward. But Bob, why don't instead of I going waxing, why don't you talk about what you think the future will look like?
Sure. I think all of you hit upon some very, very important themes. I would sum a lot of that up to where I'm just plain worried. I think that the marketplace is changing at increasingly fast rates. And with that, the ability for our ecosystem to keep up with that is a challenge. It's quite difficult, to say the least. And my worry is, can our self-regulatory systems keep pace with that? If marketers and agencies and publishers and media companies are confused and don't necessarily get it right, then we have to increasingly rely upon the self-regulatory system to be able to answer those challenges with us and for us. And that may require a headset change among all parties, and a recognition that we have to step up our game because the future will be more dynamic, as Steve mentioned. The future may involve an increased partnership with government regulation and self-regulation in order to give it a greater degree of strength and ambition, because we cannot afford to let our guard down in terms of the way we operate within our ecosystem, which is increasingly opaque, Marketers and agencies are making tons of decisions without full information, and that clouds our ability to ensure that we are reaching consumers fairly and safely. Think about all of the brand safety issues that have taken place in recent years on YouTube and Facebook. That's not healthy for anyone, to say the least. But is there a regulatory system that is in fact taking place? It forced us to create GARM, the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, but is that enough? Is it strong enough? Is it capable enough? Does it have enough resources to be able to make things happen? I think we all have to look at the totality of where this marketplace is evolving and be on the defensive, not on the offensive. We need to ensure the safety of our consumers is taken care of first and foremost. And I'm not sure that we are prepared as an industry. You folks at the BBB National Programs may, but I'm not sure that the balance of the industry has had that level of conversation. And I say that we all have to give it a hard look to see what it is that we need to do to ensure that we protect the consumer at its core.
Steve, Marla, do you want to comment on what Bob just said?
I fully agree that there's going to be some sort of blend of government and self-regulation. I think that there has to be something moving forward, and it kind of echoes what Steve was saying earlier, just in terms of the complexity and where we're going. We need to be able to manage that, and the onus should not be on the consumer. I think that's been the challenge, is you can't have the consumer trying to figure all of this out. It's just too much. We need to find a way to make it easier for them to have the right kind of experience and to feel protected, and that they can trust the information that they're receiving.
I would add two things. One is that all of these conversations are bigger than just advertising, and they take into account the full ecosystem of what we've come to be pretty jaded about as an industry, and trust and transparency. I keep hearing, and I think that's going to be vital to the future success of all this. That's the one thing that we certainly can all agree on, and building consumer trust has always been at the center of the intent of what we've tried to do. I have this deep sense that we have to leave this industry better than we found it. 50 years ago, Howard Bell and Wally Snyder saw the need and the value in doing that, and they built a solid and firm foundation. For me, this is about taking something that is established and continuing to evolve it into meeting the demands of the current marketplace. And I believe that was their vision in the original laying out of the plans. And I think that we owe it to them and to everyone that's out there that will continue to build on it and evolve it to meet the changing marketplace.
Certainly one of the changes that we're seeing in the last few years, and hopefully, and frankly, last few decades, but more emphasis in the last few years, is the area of diversity and inclusion in advertising, in our greater journeys. Each of us are going through a journey right now of racial justice in this past year within our own organizations, within our industry as well. And I feel free, I wonder if anyone would like to comment on sort of where they see the next 10 or 15 years in diversity inclusion in advertising and advertising self-regulation.
I think we're going to see significant shifts, because there are plans that have been put in place over this past year, and a real recognition that enough hasn't been done. And as the country continues to change, and if you look out, I think we'll hit by 2030, we're going to start to see a real demographic shift. But clearly by 2050, where a majority becomes a minority, I mean, you see all those shifts. You have to start reflecting that in not just who is creating the content and the advertising, but who's actually in your advertising and the way that you're delivering against that. So to me, the next 10 years, we need to see significant change, and it finally feels like there's a real commitment to deliver against that, which I think is wonderful.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. I think Marla is exactly right. And what we have been finding is that the emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion is just not the right thing to do, but it's also good for business as well. There are enough empirical studies out there that suggest that when marketers and agencies pay increasing attention towards representing women in cultures fairly and accurately, their businesses in fact perform better. And that's an encouraging thing for us to all embrace and to do the right thing. But it's also just simply about the way we should behave. And this goes to a lot of what Howard Bell and Wally Snyder also articulated, is that we have to be an ethical industry. And we've lost ethics. And I know Wally is working very hard these days to really bring back ethics as a foundation pillar for what it is that we do. When we turn our back on ethics, you get a lot of the bad stuff that really starts to happen, because not everybody's going to catch every bad thing out there. We alluded to before some of the brand safety issues that have been taking place out there. Well, that's bad for businesses, it's bad for consumers, it's bad for people. There isn't anything good that comes out of hate speech and harmful speech that's out there. So we have to become more in tune with this. We have to create standards of behavior that eliminate all of those bad things that I've been talking about. And then there's one more thing which I'd like to suggest that should become an increasing part of our strategic overhaul, and that is our increasing focus on sustainability, which also brings into focus a whole range of conversations that I don't think we're prepared as an industry to fully embrace, although we're starting to see things move in that direction.
Yes, this is in the future. Right now, we talk a little bit about ESG, diversity and inclusion, and I think the aspect of, in addition to sustainability, the issue of social in ESG is one that I think over the next 10 and 20 years we will see major changes. You mentioned earlier, Bob, KRU, our Chilled Advertising Review Unit. We are redoing our guidelines. We hope to announce them, some of them next month. And one of the areas that we are looking at is diversity and inclusion and stereotyping of advertising. I think going forward, Laura and her team are exploring with many of our national partners and our collaborators sort of the role of stereotyping in advertising as well, and whether or not it makes sense for the NAD at some point in the future to look at these issues as well. We're getting a lot of great feedback from others. So if we look at the future of ad law, the future of self-regulation, I think both ESG, sustainability, as well as the diversity and inclusion will be topics that we will all discuss going forward. So we are at about an hour, and I promised our viewers that we would be about an hour. So we've covered quite a lot in today's conversation, and I think that there's quite a lot more we could have discussed. In fact, these last two topics, we could have our own programs on just each of those as well. But what this panel has reinforced for me is what an honor it is, an honor for me to lead BBB National Programs and to serve in partnership with thought leaders and board members such as Bob, Marla, and Steve, and to work so closely with Laura, who runs and leads our top-notch team at the National Advertising Division. I imagine that many of you who have joined us today are very familiar with the work of BBB National Programs, but other of you have learned snippets about it today for the first time. We are champions of industry self-regulation in the United States, but we don't just cheerlead the issue of self-regulation. We collaborate with like-minded organizations to build meaningful and independent industry self-regulation programs. As I mentioned earlier, we currently run 16 programs, but we're looking for more. If you have an idea for a self-regulation program in your industry, please contact me directly. Happy to talk to you. We also have a new 501c3 foundation, the Center for Industry Self-Regulation, which we'll be incubating some of these new self-regulation programs on an accelerated time frame using our 50 years of experience. But today's event, on the other hand, we must bring to a close. And frankly, in this world of the pandemic, we imagine that your next Teams or Zoom or WebEx meeting is about ready to begin. And we thank you for your time and attention you gave us today. So, but on behalf of the entire team of BBB National Programs and all of us who've come before us in building self-regulation programs in the United States for the past 50 years, thank you and have a great afternoon. And thank you to Bob, Steve, Marla, and Laura for their time and thoughtful comments today. Have a good afternoon.